This time I'd like to talk about the new Focal Clear pair of dynamic driver headphones. So as you may know already, I previously owned the Focal Elear, which I grabbed when it first came out, and now have a Focal Utopia as a daily driver and reference headphone. So being priced in between those two headphones, I was interested in the Clear, and I'd like to thank SCV Distribution for loaning me a pair for review. First things first, this thing's frame looks exactly like the Focal Elear, except gray instead of black. They even weigh the exact same amount at around 450 grams without the cable. The differences are in the internals. While using the same M-shaped dome aluminium magnesium drivers of the Elear, Focal has made some changes to the voice coil to control driver breakup. So the Clear is also 55 ohms, while the Utopia and Elear are 80 ohms, so this is a bit easier to drive. The pads are a huge difference from the Elear because these are microsuede perforated pads and definitely give me a more open feeling than the Elears did back in the day. Furthering the differences in the Clear as a product from its brothers, it comes with a hard shell carrying case alongside three cables. So two of these are 3 meters long, with one terminated in a quarter inch and the others in a balanced 4-pin XLR. The final cable is obviously meant for portable devices because it's 1.2 meters in length and terminated in a 3.5mm jack with a converter provided for quarter inch as well. So as a guy who bought both the Utopia and the Elear, I can't help but feel a little jealous of the Clear owners for getting all these features, as the prior line only got a single very long and very thick cable, and that was it, terminated in quarter inch. The feeling of the Clear's cables are also quite different because even the 3 meters one feel light, and the makeup is flat and covered in a zigzagging zebra pattern instead of the really big and thick Utopia and Elear cables. As with the others in the line, I found the comfort to be quite stellar. What I found especially interesting is that it felt considerably lighter than the Utopia despite only being 40 grams less in weight. Not only that, but the bill seems to have been tightened up a bit because this doesn't creak or squeak at all when I handle it. It also locks onto my ears and I can headbang with them on if I want to. They simply don't really budge. Now I wouldn't dare doing that with the Utopia, which can shift in place if you move your head sometimes. So I can appreciate the look of the Clear aesthetically, although I'm definitely biased towards the Utopia's showroom piece design. I do feel that some detractors might single out the fact that it looks like the Elear as a negative, but I don't personally have a problem with that. The microsuede pads are comfortable on the ears and apparently serve a purpose in shaping what these do versus the Focal's 2016 line sonically. So, sound quality wise, I gotta give a little context to my sound impressions here first. When I first heard the Elear and Utopia at London Can Jam 2016, I was really taken aback by how dynamic and how hard hitting they were. The attack on both may have single handedly reshaped what I wanted in a headphone, taking me from preferring laid-back cans to something with a bit more kick to them. My first impressions of the Clear were that it didn't have that abrupt attack and power to it that really confused me a bit at first. It clued me into the fact that this was no mere Elear side grade with the pad change, and something else. It's actually something that stands apart from its brothers. Continuing on talking about presentation, the Clear is the most laid back of the three, and indeed the most even sounding. Focal has done away with the mid-bass heft that was standard on the Elear and replaced it with a smoother transition between the bass and the mid-range on the Clear. So the bass itself isn't especially elevated, but it maintains a good body to it. Keeping with what I said earlier, it doesn't hit as hard as the Elear or Utopia, and it has a slight softness to it that reminds me a bit of the LCD2 by Odyssey, except still more lively and more textured. The soundstage width of the Clear is quite clearly in the same realm as the Elear. Hell, all three headphones are quite intimate in staging width, so while it's not quite the awe-inspiring depth of the Utopia, I'd say the Clear's presentation is really quite good. Instrument separation is done really well, and I really found this to be the case when I was listening to the layers and layers of guitar work on Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction album. The lower mid-range isn't as thick as the Elear, but it retains good body that helps male vocals and the lower strings on acoustic guitars. The mid-range itself I found to be a bit on the lusher side than the Utopia, which I can definitely see being more appealing to those who aren't quite into the idea of a dry and analytical headphone. That being said, it isn't nearly near the level of a LCD4 in this regard, and it is still in the realm of not being quite a flavor can in my opinion. I found listening to rock music especially enticing on the Claire, and I'm not quite sure why, because I do find the presentation of distorted electric guitars to be a bit more realistic on the Elear and Utopia compared to the Claire, but the Claire still doesn't bother me too much. Especially the Elear had this certain rawness to it that resembled the sound of a live guitar amplifier, while the Claire is a bit more of a, it's a bit better as putting together the blend of all the instruments in a mix. The upper mid-range sounds less dipped than the Elear, although it isn't emphasized like on some other headphones. And I have to admit, the Elear felt like it fell off a cliff in this region, and this was a deal breaker to many. This means that female vocals are considerably less distant sounding on the Claire than on the Elear. This also means that the overall sound has a more even feeling going into the treble, which is well extended but not as emphasized as on the Utopia. The treble of the Claire is probably the most laid back aspect of it, in my opinion. I know at least one person who prefers it to the Utopia for this reason, and that guy's favorite headphones, for comparison's sake, are the Odyssey LCD4. So it's not rolled, it's far from rolled, but there's a slight veil to it when compared to the more analytical, revealing, and downright unforgiving focal Utopia. And personally, my own preferences line up with the Utopia in this regard, but I ain't even mad at the Claire for this because it's doing something quite different here and it's appealing to a different audience. So what is that audience? I'd say people who want to upgrade from the Sennheiser HD650 but found the Elear's upper mid-range dip and overall presentation to be a deal breaker. The same people might find the HD800 too wide in soundstage or too bright or too strident at times with different amp pairings. But this is purely speculation on my part, but I do think the Claire caters to this market quite well. But is it the Utopia killer that I've heard some people mention online? Hell no. The Utopia's technicalities are clearly superior, but I definitely see the Claire's tonality to appeal to others. So comparing it to the Focal Elear, once my daily driver, the Focal Elear holds a special place in my heart for what it introduced me to back in the fall of 2016. I admit that I reviewed it thinking it would be a widely appreciated headphone, and I really didn't see it being anything but. It wasn't until I joined the online community a few months after my review that I was exposed to various complaints about the headphone that people had, and that was an eye-opening experience to me as well, and it told me to try and visualize a product's appeal to different preferences of which I am familiar. So where does that leave the Elear today? Simply put, it's a very punchy and somewhat mid-bassy headphone with decent technicalities in terms of detail retrieval and whatnot. Where it falls apart for many is with its shoutiness, especially at higher volumes, and upper mid-range dip. I kept seeing it being touted upon its unveiling as being a super Sennheiser HD650, which I can say now is simply not the case. And at the risk of sounding like a moron, I'd say that the Claire is closer to being that than the Elear by a considerable margin. Less emphasis on the mid-bass opens up the Claire to be more compatible with more genres of music. I certainly would pick this over the Elear for classic rock, jazz, and classical music, and the pacing of the Claire is also a bit more relaxed, with frantic metal recordings having their edge taken off a bit slightly compared to the Elear. Simply put, the Elear is a thunderous experience, while the Claire turns that down a bit and brings forth more synergy in places where that take no prisoners presentation isn't required. That isn't to say that the Claire is a boring headphone compared to the Elear, but the differences are there, and I feel that it's entirely done on purpose. Now, comparing it to the Focal Utopia, now the Focal flagship is also thunderous, but it has a level of resolution that I haven't heard in other dynamic driver headphones, except maybe the new Audio-Technica flagship, but more on that at a later date. The upper mid-range of the Utopia is more forwarded than the Claire, making stringed instruments have more body and texture. In fact, texture is the name of the game overall, to be honest, with it not losing its aspect across the frequencies, making it the most resolving and high-resolution dynamic driver headphone that I've heard to date. It's also very fast in both attack and decay. Now, one advantage that the Claire does have over the Utopia is its ability to not sound shrill at times, as the Utopia is quite unforgiving of subpar production. Now let's take a compressed pop metal song like In the End by Linkin Park. The new metal guitars and Chester's vocals in the chorus sound harsh on the Utopia, while the Claire keeps them under wraps quite a bit, but still gives them enough bite. Any other advantages will depend on the listener, to be honest. I know for a fact that the Utopia's commanding presentation can be fatiguing to some because it constantly demands your attention. The Claire doesn't do that. It's very engaging, but it doesn't cross that line. And that line is something that even the Elear crosses by comparison. The vast differences of the price make sense to me, as the Claire's technicalities are closer to the Elear than the Focal flagship. Its imaging, while stellar, doesn't enter the realm of the Utopia's intense accuracy. And comparing the two, going from the Utopia to the Claire gave me the feeling the music is slightly veiled and I have to get used to it. While switching from the Claire to the Utopia gave me the sense that, okay, I have to get used to this hard hitting, crashing down of each snare hit, for example, among other things, that the Utopia presents in this very exposing manner. So amping really quick, the Claire is really easily driven. At 55 ohms, I was able to power this with the Hy-B R6 digital audio player quite easily, along with my phone. So it's pretty easily driven. It does scale, however, and I was able to pick out familiar differences while tube rolling on my Dragon Inspire IHA1 tube amplifier. That being said, I wouldn't say it's as revealing as a Utopia in this regard of source. But I also did run it out of my Auto GD NFB 28 amp section, but that is just overkill with its high output. So to sum it up, I do quite like the Focal Claire, while realizing that it's not a headphone targeting me. As I mentioned before, the speed and accuracy of the Utopia is an experience I find exhilarating and kind of near necessary now, and the Claire doesn't quite do that. Focal clearly isn't trying to do that though, with its more laid back and even approach being worth commendation in my opinion. And I can see this being more of an all-rounder to somebody than the Utopia, particularly to those who will find the Utopia overwhelming and kind of fatiguing. So I do really like this headphone, to sum it up. There will be more details in my written review, which I'm still working on as I'm recording this, and it should be in the video description below. Please do check that out. I will throw all added details that I can into that. But in the meantime, thank you for checking out this review, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.